You wake up on a frozen island. No walls, no roof, just wooden stakes driven into mud and water on every single side of you. It's the year 1252, and somebody, well, nobody agrees on exactly who, has just decided that this tiny swampy island, wedged between a lake and the sea, is the safest place in the entire region to put a fortress. But here's the problem. There is no soil to farm, there is no forest to hide in, and there's barely enough land to stand on. If an enemy fleet comes from the Baltic Sea, you have nowhere to run. You're surrounded by water on every side. So why here? Why would anyone choose to build a city on a rock in the middle of nowhere when there was an entire continent of better land to pick from? Stick around, because the answer to that one decision explains everything that happens for the next 770 years. An empire, a massacre, a plague, and a swamp turned into one of the richest cities on earth, and a nation that somehow walked through 2 world wars without even getting touched. But to understand why the island was chosen, you have to go back further, because Stockholm wasn't the first choice. It wasn't even the second. It was what was left after everything else had already failed. Chapter 1: The Undefended Kingdom. 250 years before Birger Jarl ever set foot on that island, this stretch of water didn't look like anything it does today. Lake Mälaren wasn't a lake, it was a long open bay of the Baltic Sea, and it worked like a highway straight into the heart of Sweden. Any ship that could sail the Baltic could sail directly inland, all the way to the kingdom's richest, most important towns. No walls, no toll gate, no chokepoint to stop them. Now imagine you're one of those towns. You've spent generations building wealth, churches, markets, a cathedral, a bishop's seat. You are on paper one of the most important places in the entire kingdom. And the sea leads right to your front door. In the year 1007, a Norwegian raider named Olaf sailed into the same waterway and plundered the settlements along it. A small fishing camp on the site mentioned in old accounts, a place that may be the very ground Stockholm would later stand on. That raider would go on to become king and eventually a saint, but that's not the part that matters here. What matters is this: the kingdom's wealthiest towns had just been shown in the most violent way possible that they were completely exposed. And nobody fixed the problem, and for nearly 200 years nobody built the wall, nobody blocked the channel, and the wealth kept growing, and the vulnerability never went away. Then in August of 1187, it happened again, and this time it was catastrophic. Raiders from across the Baltic sailed the same open water straight to the town of Sigtuna, one of the most important Christian centers in the entire kingdom, and burned it to the ground. The Archbishop of Uppsala was killed trying to flee, and chronicles describe barricades thrown up too late at the one narrow exit point, in a desperate attempt to trap the raiders on their way out. Let me tell you, it didn't work. The raiders escaped, and Sigtuna never fully recovered after that. Here's the question that should have been asked decades earlier, and now couldn't be avoided. If the enemy can sail straight into the center of your kingdom, unopposed, not once but twice, what's the actual solution? Because you can't move the sea, and you can't outbuild every raider who might come, but you can choose the one narrow gap of water that every single ship has to pass through to reach the interior, and put something there that wasn't there before. That's the decision Birger Jarl inherited, not a blank canvas, a kingdom that had already been humiliated twice, still bleeding confidence, still watching its richest town sit undefended. So when he looked at the cluster of small islands sitting exactly where the inland waterway met the open sea, he wasn't picking a nice spot for a castle. He was closing a door that had been left open for 2 centuries. Chapter 2: The Chokepoint. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you control the only door into a house, and every single person who wants to get inside or get out has to pass through you. You didn't build the house, you didn't build the walls. All you did was find the door, and suddenly you control everything that happens inside. And that's what Birger Jarl was really doing in 1252, when he ordered a fortress built on this small island, closing the one gap of water that raiders, merchants, and everyone else had been sailing through for generations. The location guarded the entrance from Lake Mälaren to the Baltic Sea, controlling trade between the interior of Sweden and the coast. And every ship carrying iron, every ship carrying furs, timber, or the copper that Sweden was sitting on top of, all of it now had to funnel through this narrow gap of water past this one fortress to actually reach the open sea. And whoever held this island held a toll booth for an entire kingdom's trade, and the lock on the door that had once let raiders walk right in. And almost immediately, something strange started to happen. German merchants, professional traders from the powerful Hanseatic League, began showing up, not as invaders, as business partners. And by the 13th century, Stockholm had already become a vital trading hub, particularly for iron and copper. And within a few decades, this rock with no farmland had become the biggest city in the entire kingdom, which raises an uncomfortable question. If outsiders were the ones bringing the money, the ships, and half the population, who actually owned the city? And that question doesn't get answered peacefully. It gets answered with blood, and it takes 268 years to boil over. Chapter 3: The Bloodbath. Fast forward to November 1520. Picture this: you're a nobleman in Stockholm, and you've just been invited to a royal celebration, a coronation, feasts, music, an amnesty declared for old political enemies. The new king, Christian II of Denmark, has personally promised forgiveness, peace, and a clean slate. And you believe him. Why wouldn't you? He said it out loud, in public, and in front of witnesses. And 3 days later, soldiers sealed every exit of the castle courtyard. And roughly 100 people, bishops, noblemen, merchants, city councillors, are dragged out and executed in the main square, one after another, while the rest are forced to watch, and bodies pile up in the rain, and it becomes known permanently as the Stockholm Bloodbath. And these weren't random victims. Christian II had a list. He knew exactly who to remove to make sure no one could ever challenge his grip on Sweden again. And the so-called amnesty, it wasn't mercy, it was just bait. He needed everyone in one single place, unarmed and relaxed before he could strike. Which means the real mystery isn't who died in that square, it's how many people in that crowd suspected something was wrong and stayed anyway, because walking away from a king's invitation was his own kind of death sentence, and this massacre was supposed to end resistance forever. But instead, it created something far more dangerous than the men Christian II had killed. It created a martyr's son. Chapter 4: The Escape That Built the Nation. One of the executed noblemen had a son, 24-year-old Gustav Vasa, who was on the run. And for the next 2 years, Gustav Vasa moves through the Swedish countryside disguised as a farmhand and hiding in barns, narrowly escaping capture more than once, while he's trying to convince suspicious and exhausted villagers to rise up against the occupying king. Nobody wants to listen at first, because rebellion means death if it fails, and everyone remembers the square full of bodies. So try to sit with that for a second. You're being hunted, you have no army, no money, and no castle, and your only weapon is your name and the story. The story that the massacre wasn't justice, it was murder, and it's coming for the rest of them next. And eventually the story works. Villages join him and the rebellion grows. And by 1523, Gustav Vasa is crowned King of Sweden, and the tiny trading island that Birger Jarl built 270 years earlier becomes something new. It becomes the beating heart of an independent kingdom, no longer answering to Denmark or foreign merchants. Chapter 5: The Invisible Killer. Here's something almost nobody thinks about when they picture old European capitals. For most of Stockholm's history, the deadliest enemy wasn't an army, it was your own city. Picture narrow medieval streets and wooden buildings packed edge to edge, with no sewage system and thousands of people crammed onto an island barely big enough for a few hundred houses. And now add rats. You see where this is going. Plague swept through Stockholm multiple times over the centuries, and each time the geography that made the city rich, dense, walled and waterlogged became the exact reason it couldn't escape disease. You can't quarantine your way out when the whole city is on one small island and everyone shares the same well. And fire was just as brutal. Wooden buildings, open flames for heat and cooking, streets too narrow for anyone to stop a blaze once it started. Entire districts burned to the ground more than once. So think about the odds you were actually facing if you lived here in, say, the 1500s. Foreign invasion, political purges, plague, and fire, and you're standing on an island where there's nowhere left to retreat to. And yet, the city didn't just survive all of that, it was thriving, and it was about to become one of the most powerful capitals in Europe. Chapter 6: The island that became an empire. By the 1600s, Sweden, ruled from the same small island city, had somehow become a European superpower. Its armies were fighting across Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states, and in 1634, Stockholm officially became the capital of Sweden, right in the middle of this explosive rise, a period historians now call Sweden's Age of Greatness. And in Swedish it's called Stormaktstiden. How does a kingdom this small, built around a city this cramped, end up controlling territory that's stretched across Northern Europe? Part of the answer is the same chokepoint logic from 4 centuries earlier. Control the trade routes and control the wealth and fund the army. But part of it is something stranger. An eccentric, brilliant queen who turned this cold trading post into an intellectual capital. Queen Christina filled her court with scholars, philosophers, and scientists from across the continent, even convincing the French philosopher René Descartes to move to Stockholm to tutor her personally. She transformed Stockholm into the Athens of the North by inviting scholars and artists to the capital, enriching the culture. Then she did something almost nobody expected from a monarch at the height of her power. She abdicated the throne, converted her religion in secret, and left the country entirely, walking away from an empire most rulers would have killed to hold on to. And the empire she left behind, it didn't last at all. Wars drained it, and a catastrophic conflict with Russia and its neighbors in the early 1700s, the so-called Great Northern War, bled Sweden of money, soldiers, and territory until the empire collapsed. Almost as fast as it had risen, Stockholm went from capital of a superpower to capital of a diminished kingdom in the span of a single generation. So what do you do when the empire is gone but the city is standing? Well, you wait and you change. Chapter 7: The Century of Leaving. Jump forward to the 1800s and Stockholm looks less like an imperial capital and more like a warning. Overcrowded, poor, and disease still spreading through packed working-class neighborhoods. Sweden as a whole was struggling so badly that over the course of this century, more than 1 million Swedes, a staggering fracture of the entire population, packed up and left for America. Now try to imagine standing in Stockholm's harbor and watching your neighbors board ships, one family after another, because staying felt more dangerous than crossing an ocean to a country they'd never seen. And that's not the image most people have of Sweden today. And that's exactly the point. Because somewhere in the next 100 years, this same struggling, half-emptying city figured out something that almost no other European capital managed to pull off. Chapter 8: The Country That Dodged the War. 2 world wars tear across Europe in the 20th century, and nearly every capital city on the continent gets either bombed, occupied, or both. Stockholm doesn't. And here's the thought experiment. Imagine you're a small country sitting right next door to Nazi Germany, sharing borders and everything and waters with nations being invaded one after another. What do? Sweden's answer was a careful, uncomfortable balancing act. Declared neutrality, and backed by a rapidly modernizing military, combined with a trade concession to Germany that historians still debate the morality of today. It wasn't clean, it wasn't fully heroic, but it worked. In the narrow sense that mattered most, the bombs never fell on Stockholm. While the rest of Europe spent the late 1940s digging out of rubble, Stockholm's factories and harbors and neighborhoods were untouched. And this untouched infrastructure meant a massive head start. And that head start became the foundation for something almost nobody would have predicted from Stockholm or Sweden in that matter. The modern Swedish welfare state, and one of the most stable economies this world has ever seen. Chapter 9: Stockholm today. Today, the same chokepoint that Birger Jarl fortified in 1252, the door that stayed open for 2 centuries before someone finally closed it, is still there. It's just buried under nearly 800 years of expansion, and instead of 1 island, it's now 14, and it's connected by more than 50 bridges, holding one of the most livable and wealthiest cities on the planet. A company that reshaped how the entire world listens to music. Spotify was born in the city, and so was a global gaming empire behind Minecraft. So a city that spent most of the centuries fighting plagues, fires and invasions, and also a hemorrhaging population, has now become one of the most influential tech capitals on Earth. So let's just go back and backtrack to the very beginning. Not to the fortress, a little bit further back. To the raiders sailing straight into the heart of an undefended Sweden, not once, but twice, and also decades apart, while nobody closed the door. So we have Birger Jarl to thank for that. But Birger Jarl didn't invent the idea of a choke point. He just finally acted on the lesson that the kingdom had already paid for in blood, twice. So the island never protected Stockholm with walls. It protected it with position, the one unmovable fact that outlasted every raid, every massacre, every empire, and every war that tried to erase it. Which leaves one last question worth sitting with. If a door left open for 2 centuries can quietly decide the fate of a nation, what open door are you walking past right now that nobody's bothered to close? Think about that.